Welcome back, everyone, after that brief break. For those of you who didn't join us in the last session, I'm Daisy Chapman-Chamberlain. I'm Specification Manager at Rail North Partnership, overseeing development and improvement of rail in the north of England. And you've joined us today to talk about the future of Great British Railways and how we can learn from the lessons of Scotland. And we are joined by Alex Hynes, Director General, Rail Services at the Department for Transport. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning.
We have got a few questions that we're going to be discussing on the stage, and then we will be opening up to audience questions. So please be thinking of those as we go through, and we'll make sure to get a microphone to you when the time comes. But for now, Alex, if you'd like to give us a little bit of a potted history.
Yeah, of course. So, yes, Director General of Rail Services at the Department for Transport. I'm not the only rail DG at the Department for Transport. We have one focused on rail reform, Richard Goodman. He's proceeding with the bill, which is going to create Great British Railways. And we have Alan Over, who's the Director General for Major Rail Projects Group, which is primarily HS2, but not exclusively HS2. Prior to that, I want a 2 years to comment. Prior to that, I ran the railway in Scotland for 7 years, which was a very strange job, because I was the Managing Director of Network Rail in Scotland and the Managing Director of ScotRail at the same time, which explains why I don't have enough hair.
Just a bit of work then?
Yeah, and prior to that, I did 4 years as the Managing Director of Northern Rail. Never worked for BR, I'm not an engineer, I'm an economist. Fell into railways, but obviously passionate about this sector and making the railway better for the people of Britain.
Brilliant, which is music, I think, to everyone's ears in this room. So I think we'll kick off then with the obvious question about the ScotRail Alliance itself, obviously always discussed as a success, you'll be happy to know, with some challenges along the way. So I think we'd all like to know a little bit more about the process as you saw it, as you joined the organisation, and ultimately where you took the organisation directionally.
So it starts with Transport Scotland. Because Scotland has a transport strategy. Wales has a transport strategy. England famously doesn't have a transport strategy yet. But one of the really exciting things that we're doing within the department is producing an integrated national transport strategy for England, which is really exciting. We've done lots of regional engagement. I've been to many of the events, and I think that's going to be a real step forward. So rail in Scotland knows its place in the hierarchy, which helps a lot. And Transport Scotland view the railway as a system. And so obviously we've had 30 years of privatisation, fragmentation, and they were very cute at getting around the worst bits of fragmentation. So, for example, they would set ScotRail and Network Rail Scotland exactly the same performance targets and just expect people to get on and hit the targets. That's not currently the case in England and Wales, but we're moving towards that very soon. And then, of course, there's an alliance between ScotRail and Network Rail, which, by the way, doesn't mean bashing bits of the organisation together without a purpose. It was just a sense that this is a system. Most of the system, 92% of the railway in Scotland, is run by those two organisations. Track and train have to be working hand in glove in order to deliver for passengers and taxpayers. And then, of course, they appoint one person who's in charge of it all. And when you're in charge of it all, there's no one to blame. It's you. And your whole focus is fixing problems rather than fixing the blame. Because sometimes, as we know, currently in England, when the trains don't run on time and we try and find out why, there's a bit of that going on. Well, I'm pleased to say that's ending because we have a new rail minister, we've reinstated ministerial performance meetings, we're now setting aligned targets between track and train for Network Rail and the train operating companies. We only ever meet them together, we don't meet them separately, and we want Network Rail and every train operating company just to be focused on two measures of performance. One is cancellations and the other is time to 3 at your station. And then we can get the railway professionals pulling on the rope in the same direction to get the trains to run on time. And I'm pleased to say that performance is actually started to improve now, having been deteriorating for a number of years.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it'll stop us blaming the swans periodically, but I think that's railway tradition more than anything else. So you mentioned uniting track and train, and I think that is particularly, certainly from my perspective, as we look to the future of Great British Railways, one of the key lessons that we can learn from the way things were done in Scotland. So what are those key lessons? Would you agree that kind of track and train unification is a key one? And then also, beyond just the positives, were there any lessons learned that maybe where things didn't go so well that we should avoid emulating, I suppose?
So I think probably what didn't go well was when I arrived in Scotland, my predecessor had integrated bits of ScotRail and Network Rail together. There's an HR department, there's an HR department, there's a finance department, there's a finance department, let's integrate them. But integration is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And actually, when I arrived in Scotland, one of the things we did was consciously uncouple some parts of the alliance, because frankly, it just didn't work. So there are some key areas where track and train can work brilliantly together. Safety and performance are two. Finances is still tricky in the current industry structure because train operating companies remain separate legal entities. The routes in Network Rail are not actually legal entities in their own right, they're just bits of Network Rail, and of course they have an independent regulator. So we need to remember that when we do alliances and we do integrate, we're doing it for a reason, and we need to be focused on what those reasons are, primarily performance up, subsidy down. I think one of the things that worked very, very well is having a train operating company and a route which were very, very closely working in partnership. And by the way, every other train operating company benefited from that, because if the railway in Scotland was working for ScotRail, it generally was working for everybody.
Yeah.
And actually, train operating companies, not ScotRail, freight operating companies, were always really positive about the service they get from Network Rail Scotland, because Network Rail Scotland had a more customer-focused culture because it was in an alliance with its biggest customer. So, one of the reasons why the Rail Minister isn't here today is because today he is announcing the start of the South Eastern Railway. So this model of TOCs and routes working closely together, appointing a single person to run both, that is being announced today. Steve White has been appointed the Managing Director of South Eastern and the Managing Director of Network Rail Kent Route. He's in charge. It's his job to run that bit of railway, and he's accountable for it, and I'm sure he will do it brilliantly. And myself and the Rail Minister are absolutely convinced that this really clear accountability is critical to improving performance on the railway, because the performance on the railway is not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cancellations a number of years ago were about 2%, and now they're north of 4%. So we've got a really bright future because the railway is growing really strongly, where the top line growth is fantastic. That's despite the fact that in some parts of the country we have performance problems. So just think how fast that revenue is going to grow when performance is better.
Fingers crossed, touch wood. How, out of interest then, with this new unification in the system, do you see that working with the wider rail context in terms of open access operators, in terms of freight operating companies? If we're moving towards that unified future, what place do they have in this system?
So, as I just said, if the infrastructure is working for the primary train operating company, the chances are it will be working for everybody. And obviously, Great British Railways will have a duty to promote rail freight, which is really good. And obviously, the government are supportive of open access, providing the impact on passengers and taxpayers is taken into full consideration. So, this is an attempt to get the system to work better together. At the moment, we've got ORR regulating Network Rail, we have DFT regulating four train operating companies. The DFT is involved at a very granular level of detail, which is probably not appropriate. And so that's why the government want to move the day-to-day management of the railway out of Whitehall into an organisation like Great British Railways, staffed with railway professionals and non-railway professionals, arm's length from government to run this business, which it is, by the way. Railways are a business. You know, we've got to remember we've got a £10 billion a year revenue line. Unlike most other public services, health, policing, education, we've got a revenue line, and we must never ever forget that. We can make our own money by delivering a great service to the customer.
Yeah, and of course within that, the social value of rail in and of itself, and the inclusion value and connected marginalised communities, and all that good stuff, I think, that we know about.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky recently to visit the Northumberland line, and it was before the official opening, and we went from Newcastle down the line in one direction by train, and then we came back by transit van, because we wanted to sort of visit all the stations along the line of the route. And one of the things that really struck me was the poverty in those communities was unbelievable. And this is a part of the world where, you know, since the decline of mining, there hasn't really been a sector there to sort of help drive jobs and growth. And, you know, that railway is not a railway, it's an economic artery for those people who live in that part of the world, and it will be absolutely transformational because they can get to college, get to university, get to a job, etc. And the passenger numbers are way in excess of forecast, as usual. We're building another railway, East West Rail. Only yesterday got its first freight traffic on it. So the UK government's number one mission is economic growth. And with East West Rail, we have the opportunity to connect two of the cities in Britain which have global competitive advantage in certain sectors. And railways can accelerate that growth.
Yeah. Is there anything rail can't do, I think, is the main question. So I'm going to ask a final question, and then we'll open up 2 questions from the audience. But as we're moving towards the future of Great British Railways, obviously we're going through a lot of change, a lot of transition. And there is a sense, I think, for some rail organisations of a little bit of the industry holding its breath, and maybe slowing down in some areas, maybe struggling to commit to plans. So I think particularly in the context of Rail Live, with all the organisations that we have here and the SMEs that we have here, that supply chain element, that innovation element is especially challenging, I think, in the current context. So what would you say to those organisations who are trying to supply into the sector, be involved with the sector? How can they get engaged? But also, how do we make sure that that supply chain and that innovation is a focus into the future?
Well, firstly, I would say to people, do not hold your breath, because we've got to try and improve outcomes for passengers and taxpayers at the same time as changing our sector, which is going to be tricky. But, you know, we're doing it today. We're changing the structure of our industry, and performance is getting better at the same time. So don't wait. We know what needs to be done. We just need to do a better job for passengers and taxpayers. Get on with it. We mustn't hold our breath. Last week, the Chancellor announced the outcome of the spending review, which was the first multi-year spending review since 2021. So we've been on annual budgets for quite a long time. And we have now got a 3-year budget for OPEX. We call it RDEL in government. And we have a 4-year budget for CAPEX, which we call CDEL. And that's brilliant. We've got a multi-year settlement for train operating companies. We've got a multi-year settlement for the enhancements programme in England and Wales. And one of the things we're doing, my team are doing at the moment, is working through the consequences of those spending review, putting choices to ministers, and then ministers will decide. So getting out of annual budgets into multi-year arrangements will really help provide certainty. On things like innovation and all that great stuff, how does the innovation help me deliver higher performance and lower net subsidy? You know, that's the question. You know, often in my previous role, suppliers would get a meeting with me and say, I want to sell you this kit. And I go, okay, what are the business benefits of buying this kit? And some of them would struggle to articulate the business benefits of the kit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there's all this lovely shiny stuff which railway people get very excited about out there, but ultimately, how does it improve the railway for passengers and freight and taxpayers? We've got to be laser focused on that.
Be prepared with the headlines. That's the advice then. Make sure you come prepared.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're not in the business of buying widgets. You know, buying widgets is a means to an end. We've got to remember why.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, brilliant. Well, that's the end of my potted questions. I'd love to open up to the audience. If you want to pop your hand up if you have a question, wait for the microphone to come to you, introduce yourself, and then ask your question.
Hi, Alex. Jay Heavisize, Engagement Manager at RSSB. You talked about collaboration between integrating passenger train operators on the track. How do you see it working in the future for private companies like open access operators in freight?
Well, essentially we're taking the DfT-owned bits of the railway and creating Great British Railways. But there's going to be an enormous role for the private sector in the post-GBR railway. Freight will remain in the private sector, open access will remain in the private sector. I think 80% of Network Rail expenditures with supply chain, which I'm guessing is all in the private sector. There's all retailing, train line, etc. And in fact, even though the owning groups are in the process of leaving train operation, they continue to provide other services. So there's still going to be an enormous role for the private sector in the post-GBR railway, and the government has demonstrated that because, you know, First Group and Arriva have recently bought new trains for their open access businesses, and the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Transport were delighted to join those organisations at Newton Aycliffe to celebrate that order.
Brilliant. Gentleman just here.
Hi, Chris Sutherland, researcher in rail policy at the University of Nottingham. You talk about marrying track and train in Scotland as being a success and potentially also in Wales too. Obviously England's geographically much larger, and potential policy shifts in terms of the role that the English mayoralties are going to take as far as transport goes. So I suppose in short the question is, how does GBR marry up its relationship between the devolved regions in England and the national strategy?
So it's a great question. So the railway geography is more straightforward in some places than others. So, you know, south of the river, pretty straightforward. Anglia, pretty straightforward. Scotland, pretty straightforward. Maybe Wales. Other lines of route, West Coast Main Line, East Coast Main Line, a bit more complicated. So that's going to require some careful thought as we design GBR in the run-up to standing up GBR. In terms of mayoral combined authorities, I mean, there's going to be a bigger role for mayoral combined authorities. More devolution is government policy. And if you look at the consultation document which the department published in February, which outlined the thinking that we need to do in order to draft the second railway bill, the first railway bill being the public ownership bill, which is on the statute book, which is enabling us to deliver the public ownership programme. It sets out there the different sort of flavours and depths of how mayoral combined authorities might be involved in their railway. So I'm sure you responded to the consultation, and the government will respond in due course.
Just here at the back.
Hi, my name is Mamaray. I'm a project manager in GWR. The question I have is just basically around change. So leadership and workforce are quite key in getting change implemented and embedded. So my question is, what role has leadership visibility and engagement played in Scotland's success, and how can GBR adopt a similar people-focused approach across the more complicated and wider sector?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and you know, leadership visibility is one of those things which is always tough, and you think you'd never spend quite enough time on it. But I always like to live on the patch, so I'm commuting on the patch. So it makes leadership visibility straightforward. So you get to know people by name, and they give you great feedback on the railway that you're running. The downside of spending lots of time with the 8,000 people who are running the railway out of the HQ is then the HQ staff get a bit upset that you're not spending enough time in the HQ. So it's one of those things that you can never quite get right when you're running a railway. But what I've learned, I used to be a commercial director on a train operating company, and we used to do meet the manager events, and they were great at getting customer feedback. Customers know what the problems are with the railway, but they don't know how to fix them. If you talk to your staff, the staff know what the problems are on the railway, and they will tell you how to fix them for free. You just need to listen to them and act on it. And so, we made a real effort on leadership visibility. David Lister, who now works for Waterbrook, was a director of ScotRail. And when we were out and about on the network, we just tried to come back to the office and fix one thing. And then if the senior management team were out and about once a week talking to people, and we fixed one thing, we're making the railway better. And I was delighted to see in the latest transport-focused data, ScotRail getting 91% customer satisfaction, which is brilliant. And that's our opportunity to make it that good in other places. So the other thing I would say is obviously most people are in favour of public ownership. If you look at the polling, it's an incredibly popular policy, and that includes our staff. And so when I was in Scotland, we brought ScotRail in from private ownership into public ownership. And I think that made some of the aspects of running a railway easier, because until that point, every single day in the newspapers, there was a debate about, ScotRail being run for profit, blah, 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 just vanished. So I think we're pushing an open door here with the public, and of course the staff are part of the public.
Yeah,
and the trade unions, of course, are in favour of public ownership. So, there's an alignment there of direction.
Absolutely. Just here at the front.
Hi, Tony Lee from Salesforce. I do have a cheeky question, so this is a more serious question, and I'll give up my spot.
Ask your cheeky question, Tony.
Alex, so you mentioned at the beginning you're one of 3 DGs at the departments.
Yep.
So if policy or priorities, God forbid it, they conflict, how do you resolve it with your colleagues?
We have meetings and we talk to each other. No, I mean so the department currently is very rail focused. Some of that is due to the spend. Some of that is the fact that there are things that are currently done in the department which might be best done in industry. So actually, the creation of GBR will see quite a lot of people from the DFT leave the DFT and go into GBR. And I think my colleagues at the department are quite looking forward to being the department for transport rather than the department for trains, which is how it feels to some people some of the time. So, I mean, Richard Goodman and I, the director for Rail Reform, he and I work hand in glove. He's a career civil servant. He's brilliant. He knows how to navigate Whitehall, get the bill through. I know about railways. And so the two of us work really, really well. Obviously, Secretary of State is making an announcement today around HS2. One of the things we're starting to think more about, I think the National Rail Network and the GBR Rail Network needs to start thinking a bit more about the impact of HS2 on the national network, because everyone's assuming that those services will be part of Great British Railways. Might not be, but that's a planning assumption. And what's the network going to look like then? So I don't, it's quite harmonious. I think the challenge is particularly on the train operating company side, the Department for Transport is involved at such a level of detail, which is probably not appropriate for a central government department. And there's cross-party consensus that we should get Whitehall out of the day-to-day running of the railway.
Thank you.
Any more? I think this gentleman at the back just got there first.
Thanks very much. Hi, Phil Ballman, Alpha Media. Hi, Alex. Question about the leadership change that is obviously going to happen. You mentioned about Steve White and I guess Lawrence as well, bringing track and train together, and you've got these two sets of organisations that you're trying to bring together with a new focus. You talked a little about how that was already perhaps pre-aligned a little bit more in Scotland, and perhaps it might be in other parts of the UK. Just interested in your thoughts about how you're thinking to make that work, what experience you'd have, how you bring that into GBR.
So I think we're in a transitional phase. So, for example, Steve White is a train operating company employee and he's running track and train. I was a Network Rail employee and I was running track and train. Great British Railways requires an Act of Parliament to create it. We need to design what Great British Railways looks like on day one, and then clearly the Secretary of State will appoint a chair and chief executive of Great British Railways, and it kind of all flows down from there, really. So I think we've done a lot in the last 11 months. We've changed the law. We've returned the first train operating company to public ownership. We're doing the next one next month. But I think sometimes people are expecting a bit more detail, and we have to remind people that we haven't introduced the bill into Parliament yet to create Great British Railways. Now, obviously, we will be working at pace to get that through Parliament, but we probably shouldn't put the cart before the horse.
Perfect. And then last questions just here at the front.
Thanks. Ruth Tank, Epion Consulting. We know that the railway has a very strong culture. People feel quite passionately about being railway people. And we know that different government organisations, TOCs, FOCs, also have their own unique culture. What are some of the issues that could potentially happen when you start mashing lots of different organisational cultures together as part of GBR? Have you got experience of that? And how did you address those issues?
So yeah, I mean, train operating companies and Network Rail have different cultures. When people criticise the infrastructure manager and say, oh, they're not as customer focused as we would like them to be, that's not a surprise because we divided them from the customer 30 years ago. Yeah. And I think this is where the design of GBR comes in, because there are still some questions to decide about. Is it going to be a holding company overseeing a number of local railways, or a highly centralised? These all decisions will be made for ministers. I think the working assumption is that Great British Railways will be a highly devolved organisation where local management teams and local organisations can run their railway, because all other things being equal, being closer to the action will enable them to deliver a better service for passengers and taxpayers. But these are decisions for ministers to make in due course. But as organisational restructuring and culture change is not straightforward. Great British Railways will be a very large company, and it will make up Network Rail, 14 train operating companies, a bit of the DFT and a bit of RDG. That's a big job. Luckily, we don't have to do it for a few years. But you're right to raise that as an issue that will need to be addressed.
Yeah. I think the future definitely feels overall positive. I think there are a lot of challenges, but the opportunities definitely outweigh the challenges in terms of uniting everything, bringing us all back together. But brilliant. Well, that's the end of our session today. Thank you so much for joining. If we can give Alex a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done.
Thanks. And see you all for the sessions this afternoon.